Last night, I started off by researching Hooters getting bankrupted by private equity and ended up uncovering the next 2008 level economic collapse. And they're hiding the bubble inside a private equity black box that makes it almost impossible to see what they're doing. Almost. This time, they're not going to collapse the banks and make it too big to fail. They're going to bankrupt the entire American pension system. I'm almost too afraid to make this video, but it has to be done, so let's get into it. In 2008, investors and bankers were able to crash the world's economy by engaging in risky, unethical bets and investments, and they did it right out in the open. They've learned, and this time they're doing it again. Bigger investments, bigger risks, same playbook, but they're doing it behind the smokescreen of private equity in bigger numbers. They're creating a bigger bubble than before, and it's not somewhere down the road. It's here, and it's about to pop. You see, for the last month, I've been trying to figure out why these companies that private equity had acquired were failing even though they were still succeeding. Joann's 97% of their stores are still profitable, and yet they're still bankrupt. But they weren't bankrupt a year ago, and they still had the debt that private equity had stacked on them a year ago. So I wanted to know what changed. The same thing with Hooters. The same thing with... Now in 2024, private equity bankrupted 110 businesses. And that was almost double their previous record. There had been huge increases in the amount of bankruptcies each year over the past 3 years. But I didn't know what had changed because private equity had held many of these businesses for several years and they were still succeeding. Until I got my hands on an economic report and an article and found a term that nobody could explain to me. The term was back floating rate loans. I didn't know what that meant, and no article would explain it to me. So I had to go and do research in the financial prospectuses of a bunch of financial investment firms. Guys, in the last few years, private equity has taken out $3.8 trillion in adjustable rate loans. These are adjustable rate loans. These private equity firms took out adjustable rate loans. And so for the last 3 years, as our interest rates have gone up, every 30 to 60 days, the money due on the loans they stacked on top of these companies has gone up every 30 to 60 days. That's why these successful companies that private equity had acquired are suddenly bankrupt, even though they're still making money. They're bankrupt because they're paying adjustable rate loans. But it doesn't stop there. It gets so much worse because my next question is, why are the banks willing to give these risky loans to these private equity firms knowing it's going to cause them to fail? And the answer is because the banks aren't going to keep them on their books. The banks are immediately repackaging these adjustable rate loans as something called CLOs, right? Which are then packaged and sold off to our pension funds as really great debt. And they tell them that it's a diversified portfolio. Are you hearing The Big Short in real time? Literally, all of these companies are getting bankrupted in greater and greater numbers. And all of this debt is adjustable rate. And all of the bankruptcies are skyrocketing in this direction. And now, if you look at this graph, you can see that aside from 2020, which is obviously an anomaly, right now, private equity, that's the yellow section, has double the highest number of bankruptcies they'd ever had prior to last year. And that number is climbing this year, $3.8 trillion. $3.8 trillion in this debt, okay? I want you to look back to 2008. Do you want to know how many risky adjustable rate mortgages there were? $1.1 trillion. Do you want to know how many subprime but not quite as bad loans there were? $1.3 trillion. That was just in housing. In the $3.8 trillion held by private equity, they own the largest shares of the home ownership market in the United States, but they also own the daycares. They own the veterinary clinics. They own the pet stores. They own the nursing homes. They own the emergency rooms. They own the doctor's offices, the orthodontists. They own the builders. They own the HVAC companies. This isn't just housing. It's going to touch every single industry around us. And that is why, if this were a free market and private equity had not exploitatively gotten involved, if we had a free market and we could see what they were doing, these companies would be succeeding. If this were actually a free market, these companies would be succeeding. Joann's has 97% of their stores profitable. That is an astronomical number. 97% of a retail store is profitable. And they are failing, and they are closing every store. And it is further consolidating an already consolidated environment. And now there are thousands and thousands of employees that will not have jobs. And there are thousands of other businesses that are going through the exact same thing right now. And why? Because they know we will never allow the banks to be bailed out again. We would literally riot in the streets. But we're definitely going to allow them to bail out the pensions because that's our grandparents. That's our parents. That's the working class. They know that this will get bailed out. And because there's no regulatory authority, there are no laws stopping private equity from doing whatever they want, they know they can get away with it. And we can't do anything to stop them. The most important thing you need to understand is this wasn't done by accident. This was done by blatant, intentional greed. The private equity firms wanted the cheapest debt they could get, and they believed arrogantly that the debt would stay cheap forever. They had 0% interest rate loans for ages. And so they took on these adjustable rate notes thinking what? They could keep refinancing forever out of it. It was arrogant. But it also meant that they got to collect bigger fees because they were taking risky debt that cost less. The bankers were happy to give them because they got higher fees on offering bad debt. They were going to get paid no matter what. At the same time, the private equity firms mandated in their contracts with these companies they acquired that they were advisors and that they were a management company. So they also get paid that way. And then they sold the land out from under these companies and all their assets and made themselves whole before any of this even began. They're already cash positive. The banks knew they wouldn't be held accountable because they were going to bundle it up and pass it off to the pensions. And even the pensions were reckless because they're buying these mechanisms because when you purchase into private equity, when you purchase private equity debt as a pension, you get to put on your books, especially if you have an underfunded pension, the projected gains for 10 years, which means for 10 years, it looks like that pension is more shored up than it is. And at the end of that 10 years, when it's time for that fund to close out, suddenly then all of the bad debt comes crashing down on the pension. But at that point, there's a new leader on the pension fund and they've kicked the can down the road. So even they were reckless. But at the bottom of all of this is the bankrupting of the fabric of our society. We are losing our businesses. We are losing our doctors. We are losing our orthodontists. We are losing our nursing homes. We are losing our funeral homes. And one by one, they're going to fall under the weight of this really horrible adjustable rate debt. And nobody is talking about it. I could only find 2 articles in very obscure financial magazines that even talk about these back floating rate loans. I have never been more terrified. And I talk about private equity a lot. I have a lot to say. But right now, all I want to do is get someone to pay attention that can make a difference in this because we have a problem. We're not without any hope at all. Right now, private equity is only allowed to be this exploitative because they exist under something called the carried interest loophole, something that multiple Congresses have tried to close, but private equity continues to bribe politicians to fail to actually achieve. Trump, 3 weeks ago, said he wanted to close the carried interest loophole. I thought he was doing it as a fundraising maneuver. But he's doubled down on it repeatedly. If we can make enough noise about this, maybe we can get him to actually see it through and end private equity's stranglehold on our population. There's so much more that we have to go through, so this is going to be a multi-part series. But if you're new here, my name is Tiffany. We work together to fight private equity and save small businesses in our community, and it's going to take every single one of us to do so. So do all the things and stick around. I'm so glad you're here.